very careful about who he invited, that they didn't want to bring really negative people out who would try to make this out as something, contrary or negative. That if there were, people in the media who would report this honestly and clearly, and then they were welcome to invite them. But Billy was to be very careful about who he invited. To my knowledge, he invited certain family members and other friends and witnesses, and a lot of pictures were taken, but I don't know of anybody in the press that was actually invited. During the ending of this contact, Semyosi said that she wished to finish some of the history lesson that she had started once before, and so I want to continue that right here and tell you a little bit more about the history of our ancestors and bring it right up to today. Before, when we talked about history, we discussed the fact that the ancient Lyrians had spread themselves throughout the galaxy, seeded many other planets, and spread around, including, under the leadership of an Ishwish named Aesol, had moved off and formed what we today think of as the Pleiadian society. That was 230,000 years back. And then down through the centuries, on many occasions, Earth had been populated in small colonies. As a matter of fact, there have been many people from the Pleiades, Lyra, Vega, and Orion on many different occasions who had come here and settled small colonies from time to time. The first really major mass colonization that they are familiar with occurred 50,000 years back when an Ishwish named Pelagon came here and brought around 70,000 people with him. Among those 70,000 people, there were 200 sub-leaders and scientists, each one a specialist in a certain area of scientific information. They built a very large society. That society covered the entire planet. It was on every continent. There were cities everywhere. That civilization lasted for almost 10,000 years before it ended in a very violent war. Fortunately for them, they had the technology to get off the planet, and most of them fled, the ones that could survive anyway. For 7,000 years, then, there's a period where the Earth is almost totally alone, where there's nothing going on. Now, we're back to 40,000 years ago. They fled and had their war. There's 7,000 years of almost no one being here except the then developing Earth human beings, the Adams and the Evas, that's us. And 33,000 years back then, the descendants of those who had fled that big war, many of them returned. In particular, there was a great leader named Atlant, and he had a wife named Caratide, and they founded the continent that would be called Atlantis. Caratide's father's name was Muras, M-U-R-A-S, and through him they founded a city called Mu, which was located, the central city, in the Gobi Desert. The city of Mu had two underground cities, Agharta I and Agharta II, which had tunnels built between them, and that was the central seat of power for Mu. Mu and Atlantis both had their own colonizations all over the planet and sprung up all over the place. But they lived peacefully for many thousands of years, actually about 18,000 years. And then about that time, certain factions grew up in both of their societies, which were beginning to cause problems and causing one person against another. And after all these years of peace, strife broke out. There were some factions of war beginning. The governments at hand, the Atlantean and the Mu governments, would not stand for this war breaking out, and those who were attempting to cause the wars, they drove them out of town, literally. But in this case, they drove them off the planet. Well, these people left in large amounts. There was an exodus of those warlike people. They left, and I'm told they went to the Barnard Star. Some of the others may have split off and gone to different areas, but that's where the major amount of them went. 2,000 years went by where there was again peace between Atlantis and Mu and the cities of Earth. We're back to about 13,000 years now, back from our time. That's the time frame where we're at. At that point, those people who had left had built up on their own planet, the ones that were exiled. Their race had escalated and become very ruthless and very warlike. They then had a leader named Arus, A-R-U-S. They decided to return to Earth. Eris must have been quite a guy, because it says in their folklore that he was thought of as the barbarous one. He also had a strong following, had a couple hundred leaders behind him, similar to Pelagon, that were very high in the sciences and the arts. They settled in the high north country, it says, and in the area we now call Florida. In these two areas, and proceeded to start small wars again against Atlantis and Mu. One interesting fact, though, if you take the globe of Earth and look at it, and look where Florida is now. Now, if you take your hands and roll it over to where Florida moves up to the north, where Greenland is now, that's the position that the planet was in at that time. So just roll the planet over, so Florida moves up fartherly north and up to that northern area where Greenland now is, and that's the position where things were actually at. That puts the area where Atlantis was, which was the large landmass between South America and Africa, that moves it up farther north, where it's north of the equator then. Okay, more on the line almost with where America is now. So you can see that the planet was in a different position. What happened was war finally eventually did break out, that Eris and his people caused a great war to break out. There was a major war that happened between Atlantis and Mu, and that ended actually in one day. It was such a short war. They had such high technology. Just to give you a brief idea of what happened, on the history tapes that I have, this goes into much larger detail, and there's a much longer explanation all about the history and these things, but I don't have time for here. So you could listen to that if you're interested in more. But ultimately what happened was the Atlanteans, who had a large number of ships, a very large army of spacers, started an assault against Mu in the morning. And apparently within about 20 minutes' time, with these some sort of dissolving ray energy beams they have, they almost immediately annihilated the city of Mu. Now the people of Mu were thought of as scientifically being more advanced than Atlanteans, but they didn't have the number of spacers, and apparently they really weren't prepared for the immediate attack. And the Atlanteans caught them by surprise and wiped Mu out almost instantly, like I say, within about 20 minutes' time. Unknown to the people of Atlantis, as they were back celebrating and cheering their immediate victory, they had just wiped out millions of their friends, the people of Mu, the scientists of Mu, who had been expecting a war, had taken a large group of their people, flown out into space, in the area where the asteroid belt is, and found rather large chunks of the old planet Milano, which is what the debris of the asteroid belt is made up out of. They took one very large asteroid that was floating out there that was several miles in diameter, and they actually, by hooking some sort of engines or ships to that asteroid, propelled it towards Earth. They then propelled this large asteroid and smashed it right into Atlantis. When it hit, it actually didn't hit Atlantis. It exploded when it hit the atmosphere several miles above the land. But when it exploded, it ignited and blew up the atmosphere. It caused the ocean floor to crack open, and that's why Atlantis sunk down to the ocean floor. The air, the atmosphere of Earth was just black smoke and ruin for, I think, something like 40 years. It threw us off our axis and caused the rotation of the planet to actually change. So it was a rather disastrous war and wiped out just about everything. There was hardly any life left on the planet. Eris and his people survived. Most of the people who survived from Atlantis and Mu from the different cities fled to get away from the wars and the evil tyranny of Eris, and took off back to the Pleiades, Vega, Barnard Star, or other friendly places. When the dust had settled, so to speak, Eris, an Ishwish who has an expected life expectancy of over 3,000 years, was still alive, along with all of his followers. They had taken Earth. Well, there weren't too many people, though, to rule over. There was the then developing Earth human beings that were left here, and just the people that had followed Eris, and hardly anybody left from Atlantis and Mu, because the destruction was so wide-filled. Well, after a period of time, the sub-leaders of Eris, the scientists, began experimenting on the local Earth human beings, the Adams and the Evas. Through that experimentation, all sorts of diabolical creatures were created that have gone down through the years as myths. They bred humans with fish and all sorts of animals to try to do things. But among these rather diabolical experiments, some were conducted by a scientist, one of the Eris scientists, named Semyas A, with an A. In the Lyrian and Pleiadian language, if you end a name with A, it's masculine. If you end it with E, it's feminine. Billy's having